Operation Mincemeat. That's a great story and a genuinely well-documented one. Let me put together the script following your structure. I have enough solid material now. A quick note before the script. Your template is written for weapon/technology documentaries, production numbers, manufacturing, German equivalents. So I've adapted those sections to fit an intelligence operation instead, comparing it to other deception operations rather than hardware, and treating manufacture as the forging of documents and identity rather than a factory process. Everything else follows your structure closely. Here's the script, just over 3,200 words. It is 4:30 in the morning on the 30th of April, 1943, and a British submarine sits roughly 1 mile off the coast of Huelva in southern Spain. The sea is calm. The crew of HMS Seraph work quickly and in near-total silence, manhandling a heavy steel canister up through the hatch and onto the casing. Inside that canister, packed in dry ice to slow what is already a steady process of decay, is the body of a man dressed in the uniform of a Royal Marines officer. A briefcase is chained to his trench coat. His pockets are stuffed with the small, unremarkable detritus of a life, a love letter, a bill from a London tailor, a couple of theater ticket stubs, an irritable note from his bank manager. The submarine's captain reads a short passage from the burial service because, as far as any watching eyes are concerned, this is exactly what it looks like: a military funeral at sea. Then the body is eased over the side and the current is left to do the rest. Except none of it is true. The man in the uniform is not an officer. He never served. He was, until a few months earlier, a homeless Welshman who died in a London hospital after swallowing rat poison. He has no idea, of course, what is about to happen to him, because he is dead, and has been for 3 months. He is about to become, in the words later used by the men who built this deception, the man who never was. What washes up on a Spanish beach later that morning is not a person anymore. It is bait. The briefcase chained to his wrist contains a letter, supposedly written between 2 senior British generals, that appears to reveal the real Allied plan for the next stage of the war in the Mediterranean. A landing not in Sicily, the obvious target, but in Greece and Sardinia. If the Germans believe it, divisions of men and aircraft that should be defending Sicily will instead be sent hundreds of miles in the wrong direction. If they do not believe it, nothing has been lost but a body that nobody was going to claim anyway. This is Operation Mincemeat, and it matters not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it prevented. Every soldier who waded ashore in Sicily that summer and found the beaches lighter on defenders than expected, every ship that did not meet the resistance it might have, owed something to a plan built not from explosives or aircraft, but from a corpse, a chained briefcase, and a great deal of imagination. By the start of 1943, the shape of the war in the Mediterranean had become obvious to almost anyone capable of reading a map. The Allies had cleared North Africa of Axis forces. The next logical step, the one that would open the route into southern Europe, was Sicily. It was close. It was large enough to use as a staging post. Winston Churchill is reported to have said that anyone could see Sicily was next. The only question was whether Hitler was a complete fool. The trouble was that the Allies needed Hitler not to be a fool exactly, but to be wrong, and there is a considerable difference between the two. The problem facing British intelligence was not how to invade Sicily. That planning, under General Eisenhower and his staff, was already well underway. The problem was that an enemy expecting an attack on the most obvious target imaginable will reinforce it. German divisions, already stretched between the Eastern Front and the defense of occupied Europe, could be moved into Sicily and the southern Italian coast with comparatively short notice. The capture of Sicily would secure vital Mediterranean shipping routes and provide air bases for strikes on the Italian mainland, but its obvious value as a target was precisely the difficulty. Every additional German aircraft, gun emplacement, or infantry battalion stationed on that island in the weeks before the landings represented Allied soldiers who would die taking ground that might otherwise have been lightly held. Deception in wartime was, by 1943, not a new idea. Since 1942, the Allies had routinely used strategic misdirection to support their operations, and a 1939 document written under the name of the Director of Naval Intelligence had already laid out dozens of methods by which an enemy might be fooled, comparing the whole business to fly fishing. Cast patiently, change your lure, and if a fish grows wary, let the water rest. But knowing that deception was possible in theory was not the same as building one specific enough and credible enough to convince the German High Command that an entire invasion fleet was headed somewhere it was not. The existing toolkit of deception, fake radio traffic, decoy army formations, double agents feeding selective truths, had already been used extensively, and the Germans were not naive about any of it. A planted rumor could be dismissed. A double agent could be suspected, or worse, already turned. What was needed was something that did not feel like intelligence at all. A piece of evidence so apparently accidental, so soaked in the mundane clutter of an ordinary life, that no rational intelligence officer would believe it had been arranged. The challenge, in short, was to manufacture an accident convincing enough to fool professional skeptics, using nothing but objects, paperwork, and a body that would not be missed. The idea had existed in outline since before the war even properly began. A 1939 document known as the Trout Memo, drafted under the name of Admiral John Godfrey but widely believed to have been substantially written by his assistant, a young naval intelligence officer named Ian Fleming, had listed 54 possible ways of misleading an enemy. One of those, numbered 28, suggested planting misleading documents on a corpse that the enemy would discover. For 3 years, the idea sat unused. It took 2 men at MY5's 20 Committee, the body responsible for coordinating Britain's deception operations, to turn that single throwaway suggestion into something operational. Those men were Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley of the RAF, attached to MI5, and Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montague of the Royal Navy. Cholmondeley supplied the original concept, an evolution of an earlier scheme he had proposed involving a crashed aircraft. Montague, a barrister in civilian life with a gift for procedure and detail, supplied the rigor. Together, working with the pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury, they set about answering a deceptively difficult question. What kind of body, dressed as what kind of man, dying in what kind of plausible accident, would survive forensic scrutiny by a foreign government and still end up in German hands? Their answer was a body that appeared to have died after a plane went down at sea, the corpse having floated for some days before reaching the Spanish coast. This explained almost everything that might otherwise raise suspicion: bruising, decomposition, even the presence of seawater in the lungs. The Trout Memo's idea, item 28 on the list, had finally found its body in January 1943, when a homeless Welshman named Glyndwr Michael, found dying in a derelict warehouse near King's Cross Station after ingesting rat poison, was identified by Coroner Bentley Purchase as a suitable candidate. Michael had died from eating rat poison containing phosphorus, and, crucially, the small quantity involved would be very difficult for any pathologist to detect in a body that was meant to have spent days in the sea. Purchase warned Montague and Cholmondeley that the body needed to be used within 3 months, after which decomposition would make it useless for the deception. It was kept, with the coroner's office quietly breaking the usual rules around the disposal of unclaimed bodies, in a mortuary refrigerator. It had to be held at precisely 4 degrees Celsius, since anything colder would freeze the tissue, and a thawed, previously frozen body would betray the deception the moment a Spanish pathologist examined it. The body, alone, was not enough. It needed an entire fictional life built around it, thick enough that a hostile intelligence service, going through every pocket with professional suspicion, would find nothing but confirmation. Michael became, on paper, Captain, Acting Major, William Martin of the Royal Marines. The team filled his pockets with what intelligence officers called pocket litter, an identification card, a photograph of a fiancé, a theater ticket stub, keys, cigarettes, matches, and a receipt for an engagement ring. The small annoying paperwork of an ordinary officer's life, designed to feel found rather than placed. The genuinely important material, the letters intended to convince the Germans that Sicily was a feint, sat inside a locked briefcase chained to his coat, exactly as a careless but conscientious staff officer might carry sensitive documents he was not supposed to lose. One letter, addressed to the most senior, small, annoying paperwork of an ordinary officer's life, designed to feel found rather than placed. The genuinely important material, the letters intended to convince the Germans that Sicily was a feint, sat inside a locked briefcase chained to his coat, exactly as a careless but conscientious staff officer might carry sensitive documents he was not supposed to lose. One letter, addressed to the most senior British general in North Africa, described a planned Allied attack on Greece and Crete, while suggesting that any apparent move against Sicily was simply a diversion, and a second letter included a labored joke about sardines, intended to nudge German readers towards believing Sardinia was also a genuine target. Getting the body into position required almost as much engineering as the deception itself. The body was sealed inside a specially designed steel canister built to slow decomposition further during transport, disguised to the submarine's own crew as oceanographic equipment, since even most of the men aboard HMS Seraph were not told what they were really carrying. The submarine departed Holy Loch in Scotland on the 19th of April, 1943, and after a journey of well over 1,000 miles, surfaced off Huelva in the small hours of the 30th. The choice of location was not accidental. Spanish officials in the area were known to favor the Germans, and a known German intelligence agent named Adolf Klaus operated locally, making it almost certain that anything found would make its way to Berlin rather than simply being filed away by a neutral government with no interest in the war. If this is interesting so far, a quick subscribe really does help more than you'd think. What followed depended entirely on Spanish officials behaving in a manner the British had gambled on but could not control. Although Spain was technically neutral, the documents and effects found on the body were examined first by Spanish authorities and then by an agent of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, and the crucial letter was carefully steamed open, its contents copied and the letter resealed before being passed back to the British consulate, apparently untouched. From the British side, this was the agonizing part. There was no way to know, in the days that followed, whether the gamble had worked or whether a Spanish official had simply filed the whole business away as the unremarkable aftermath of a plane crash. The proof came through Bletchley Park, where codebreakers were reading German Enigma traffic. A decrypted message intercepted on the 14th of May, 1943, sent 2 days earlier, showed that German commanders now believed the Allies intended to strike at the Balkans. Montagu's team sent word to Churchill in a now famous, slightly theatrical phrase that mincemeat had been swallowed whole by the right people, and that from the best available information, the Germans appeared ready to act on it. German formations, including at least one armored division and a number of aircraft, were redirected towards Greece and the Balkans in the weeks before the actual landings in Sicily began. The precise scale of those redeployments remains debated among historians, since German archives from the period are incomplete and some movements may have had causes unrelated to mincemeat alone, but the direction of travel, away from Sicily, is well documented. Operation Mincemeat did not work in isolation. It was one strand of a much larger deception campaign called Operation Barclay, which used fake radio traffic, dummy military formations, and a web of other fabricated clues to build the same false picture from multiple directions at once. Where mincemeat differed from almost every other deception technique used by either side during the war was in its sheer intimacy. German and Japanese deception efforts of the period leaned heavily on radio deception and double agents, methods that, however effective, always carried the faint risk of being unwound by a single captured operative or careless transmission. The Americans, too, ran extensive deception units later in the war, most famously the Ghost Army that used inflatable tanks and sound trucks to simulate entire divisions, an approach built on volume and noise rather than a single, carefully placed object. Mincemeat asked for none of that infrastructure. It needed one body, one set of forged correspondence, one submarine, and a great deal of patience, and it relied for its power not on scale, but on the very human instinct to trust evidence that appears to have been stumbled upon rather than presented. The scale of the eventual payoff is where honest historians grow more careful, because cause and effect in a war fought across continents is rarely as clean as wartime telegrams suggest. When the Allies landed in Sicily on the 9th of July, 1943, they faced opposition that had been significantly weakened, partly because Hitler remained convinced the main blow was still to fall on Greece, going so far as to send Field Marshal Erwin Rommel to oversee defenses around Salonika that would never be needed. The island fell by the 17th of August, with casualties and shipping losses far below what planners had originally feared, and the entire campaign took roughly 38 days rather than the 90 that had been projected. Many historians, including the official war historian Michael Howard, credit Barclay broadly and Mincemeat specifically with a meaningful share of that outcome, though it is impossible to separate with precision how many lives were saved by a chained briefcase washing up near Huelva, as opposed to good fortune, German overstretch on other fronts, or simple Allied military superiority by that stage of the war. What can be said with more confidence is psychological rather than purely material. German intelligence assessments in the weeks before the landing show clear evidence that the deception was believed, and belief, even when later proven false, has consequences measured in divisions moved and defenses left thin. The men who built it were quietly rewarded. Montagu was appointed an officer of the Order of the British Empire in 1944 for his role, and Cholmondeley was honored similarly in 1948. Neither spoke publicly about the operation for years. Montagu eventually wrote a memoir, deliberately incomplete in its details, that became the basis for a 1956 film. The true identity of the body at the center of it all remained a state secret for decades. It was not until 1996 that an amateur historian working through declassified files at the Public Record Office uncovered evidence confirming the body had belonged to Glyndwr Michael, the homeless Welshman whose death had, by complete accident, made him useful to a country that had otherwise shown him no particular care while he lived. What lingers about Operation Mincemeat, even now, is the strange asymmetry at its heart. The man at the center of one of the most celebrated deceptions in modern military history did not volunteer, did not know, and gained nothing from his role except, eventually, a grave maintained with more dignity than his final months had offered him. William Martin was buried with full military honors in Huelva the day after his autopsy, and for more than 50 years the world mourned a fictional officer while the real man beneath the headstone remained anonymous. It was only in January 1998 that Michael's name was finally added to the grave, a small act of historical correction for a man who never asked to be part of any of it. Today, the headstone in the Nuestra Señora de la Soledad Cemetery in Huelva still reads, alongside the name Glyndwr Michael, the rank and unit of the man he was made to become. The forged letters themselves survive in British archives, available now to any historian who wishes to read the exact words that helped move German tanks several hundred miles in the wrong direction. The submarine that carried him, HMS Seraph, no longer exists, but the outline of the operation she helped carry out is taught in intelligence and military academies as a study in how deception actually works. Not through volume or bluster, but through the careful, almost forensic construction of something that looks entirely ordinary. Return for a moment to that dark water off Huelva, 4:30 in the morning, the body sliding from the submarine's casing into the Atlantic swell. Nobody on that beach the following day, finding a drowned officer with sodden papers in his briefcase, could have imagined that the man had died months earlier in a London hospital ward, friendless and unremarked. Nobody examining those letters in Berlin could have known they were reading the work of 2 intelligence officers and a pathologist, constructed with more care than most genuine military correspondence of the period. And nobody could have guessed that a man who, in life, had nothing and left no one to claim his body would end up reshaping the defense of an island he never saw, in a war he had nothing to do with.